Oh, it's 5 past, so we can start. So welcome everybody to the whole group live session for moral psychology. It's great to have you here. I hope you're having a good time. It's really nice to be here, brightening up our day. It's been really strange, so I didn't have any questions in advance. So what I did this morning was make sure that all the handouts are in PDF form for you when I normally would have been thinking hard about your questions. But as Javier asks, indeed, please post questions in the chat. Absolutely, just post away. If you prefer, there's nothing wrong with you shouting them out. So if you want to shout out your questions, you can. But on the whole, what people like to do is put them in the chat. And I think that's nice because then everybody can read them. But entirely up to you. Okay, good. So what we'll see here is Nikki's got a question. Nikki can see the role of purity, but how does authority and in-group loyalty help us against pathogens? Actually, Nikki, I'm not suggesting it does. I'm not suggesting it does. So you're referring, of course, to the finding that there was a statistical correlation between how strongly people in a particular place tend to endorse binding foundations relative to individualizing foundations and the historical prevalence of pathogens in that area. So that to me was a very interesting finding, Nikki. And I was offering that as a suggestion. I was offering that to say, look, moral abilities like concerns with purity, people who are relatively liberal often have a view on which they're somehow, it's just all bad and you shouldn't be concerned with purity at all. And the thought was that, at least in evolutionary time, some of those moral abilities around purity have been important. Now, the experiment measured binding foundations rather than purity specifically, as far as I remember. But I think it's purity that's likely to be the thing that really matters there. What I have noticed, and I think you'll notice as well if you look at some of the experiments, is that a lot of the literature focuses on binding versus individualizing, these two things, because they find it very difficult to pick out individual binding foundations. There is some research actually on collective activity, which does, if I remember rightly, does look at individual binding foundations and individual individualizing foundations. But for the most part, people are using a cruder and simpler method of just saying there are these two parts. And I think that just probably gives them more statistical power. It's probably methodological. So that's my sense. I'm happy if somebody's got a better answer to Nikki's question. But my answer is that authority and in-group loyalty don't. It's just that they tend to go with purity. And that's all that happened there. Excellent. Emily, I've got a question from you. That's marvellous. I didn't understand what you meant by purity and how it relates to morality. Could you say more about it? Aha. Well, this is actually a difficult question. So start with something very simple. You remember from the lecture that we were looking at a contrast between a purity, actually it's easy. I'm just going to actually bring this up. Emily, you remember there was a contrast. It was, one of them was up here and it was Roderick punching somebody, and one of them over here was Roderick pouring some urine into his own lap. And the thought here was that many people find both of those things morally provocative, but only one of them involves harm and the other is a paradigm example of a purity violation. So purity violations are things around sex, poo and food. So in a very famous case is a novel by, I'm blanking on this as well, a very famous novel called, okay, I've got it, Philip Roth, a very famous novel which was actually banned in Australia. I laughed at this because my Australian friends are not known for their shyness when talking about rude matters. Anyway, but I think it was called Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth, and it has this marvellous example of a boy which does the kind of disgusting thing that boys tend to do when they're little, with a piece of liver which was then cooked and eaten by the family. And what's marvellous about that is it kind of ticks off all of the possible purity violations. So Emily, your question is, what do we mean by purity? And the idea is there is a category or a dimension of moral violations which don't involve things like harm or fairness. There's no particular challenge to authority, nor is there an idea that I've got to be loyal to my in-group there. So there's this further dimension of things which are morally provocative around sex, poo and food. So often we think of those as taboos, and that's the purity domain. That's the purity domain. And the researchers that we're mainly focusing on, so Graham and Hyde, Graham in particular, his background is anthropology, and he takes the strong view that all of these ethical abilities, every aspect of them, has some kind of useful survival value. Right, so all of them have been somehow useful in communities, either in evolutionary time or as a cultural matter. And the important point of going back to the pathogens that Nikki was mentioning was purity is supposed to be important, in part because it enabled humans in the past to deal with the threat of pathogens. That was the idea. Emily, is that a bit clearer? Excellent, good. Okay, marvellous. And Nikki, I hope we're okay as well. I know that you're likely to challenge me if there's something to be challenged.
No, it's cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. Excellent. All right. In that case, let's move on to Paul. So Paul's got a comment, 1210. Do the studies on pathogens foundation correlation better support a generic difference between groups due to different adaptive evolutionary processes, or a cultural reproduction hypothesis where moral foundation profiles get passed on as memes rather than genes? Or is there simply an ambiguity here, or is this even relevant? Okay, Paul Theo, first of all, it's definitely relevant. It's definitely relevant. Secondly, I think there's an interesting issue here, isn't there? So is it that, as moral foundations theory claims, the purity thing is innate and so common to all humans, but via a process of cultural learning, some groups tend to downplay purity concerns. They don't eliminate them completely, but they tend to downplay them. So that would be characteristic of people who are socially liberal. They tend to be relatively unmoved by the thought of food taboos and so on. Whereas other people might play them up, right, in order to express their differences and so on. Is it that, or is it, as you're suggesting, that the whole thing might come from a narrowly cultural process? Now, my suggestion here is this. So, Paul Theo, I think you're asking a really good question. I think what we can say is that the data on pathogens and the historical connection between prevalence of pathogens and how strongly moral purity is felt, what that's supposed to reflect is a process of cultural learning, the role of culture. So the idea is that in places where historically there were more pathogens, as a process of cultural learning, people have in those places tended on the whole to emphasize purity concerns more strongly because it was advantageous to do so. So the data themselves are not supposed to say that there are differences in what's innate. It's consistent with the idea that what's innate is universal. But I also think that the data don't actually tell us that. The data don't tell us that. And indeed, it's very hard ever to find good evidence for innateness or not. There's very few cases where we have good research on innateness and non-innateness. A lot of stuff about innateness is just talk. So my suggestion, Paul Theo, is that the question's important and interesting, but that we shouldn't think that we can answer it by appeal to the data. All right, so let me know whether that's okay. And now, goodness, this is amazing. We've got a really good array of questions. Paul Theo?
Could I just follow up with a small follow-up question, Kimchi? It makes a lot of sense. I was just wondering, other studies where, in order to differentiate between maybe genetic or cultural influences, because, correct me if I'm wrong, I think those studies take people from certain geographical areas. Are there also studies where, for example, descendants in other countries, other parts, are also involved to sort of see whether it's more maybe genetic thing or even cultural, or I don't know, just a question whether there's studies which, for example, take immigrants from certain regions of the world and then compare those against a control group of people that still live within the culture against another group which is from another culture and still lives there, for example.
That's right. So not as far as I know, but I think that we're so far off having any clear understanding of the genetic basis of moral abilities that would just be extremely hard to interpret. So as far as I know, it hasn't been. And I mean, somebody correct me and show me a study here. My default attitude is going to be highly skeptical there. What I will say is that later in the course, we'll look at some developmental research, particularly that by Hamlin and colleagues, where they show that very early in development, in the first months of life, certainly in the first year of life, I should say, in the first year of life, you see some reflection of abilities to track ethical violations. Now, some people then say, oh gosh, see it in the first year of life, it must be innate. I think that's a bit silly myself. I think that a lot of learning can go on even in the first months of life. Of course it can. Babies are very intensively exploring their environment, and lots of things are happening in the first months of life. So I'm not suggesting that we know that's going to get it innate, but what we do know that might help there, that might be relevant to your question, is that you can find some ethical abilities very early in life. So I don't think that answers a question about genes and culture, but it does say that the role of cultural learning can only be quite limited, because although lots of learning is being done in the first months of life, it's not that your culture is having a big effect on your babies, I think. Ooh, all right, good. So Paul Thea, I'm going to move on. I think you might have said something else in the conversation. Okay, good, we're good. But there's a flood of questions. This is marvellous. So next up is Anya. You're 1213. Anya, 1213. With the question, do moral convictions and the emotions they evoke shape political attitudes? I don't see where the emotions element of the consideration is significant in order to be relevant to the question. Could you not just change the question to, do moral convictions shape political attitudes? Or do moral convictions and the degrees to which they're held shape political attitudes? Or have we just not covered the emotion element yet, and I'm just jumping the gun a bit? Anya, fantastic. Okay, so I'm not saying I know you super well, but I'm getting to know you, and this is characteristic of this very sharp mind in action. Thank you, Anya. That's very helpful. I think essentially you're right. You're absolutely right. So far, we haven't seen that emotions play a role at all. And I do want to make a connection here, but I don't want to suggest... I do want to make a connection with emotions, and that's why the question's framed like it is at the very end. But at the same time, Anya, I think that the connection to emotion is something where we don't have the level of confidence that we can sort of say, there is definitely a role for emotion here. So we couldn't all, I doubt that we'll all agree that there's a role for emotion here. And I don't think that we should all agree. I think different people will take different views on this because the evidence is relatively weak there. So I think you're right. This is related, Anya, to a key issue about moral foundations theory. So moral foundations theory relies for its operationalization on the moral foundations questionnaire. And the idea of the questionnaire is that you're able to tap into particular foundations. And I think that makes a lot of sense if we accept the social intuitionist model, on which broadly emotional processes are what are driving people's responses primarily, influenced by culture, but not directly by individual reasoning. If that's right, then we can get at what groups of people are likely to think and how the moral foundations are expressed in their culture, because there aren't really individual factors. There aren't really factors that would give rise to significant individual differences. So if we accept that emotion plays a big role in how people are answering questions about particular moral issues, then the moral foundations questionnaire seems like a good operationalization of moral foundations theory. Once we reject that, it's going to seem a lot more difficult. So this is something we'll come on to later as well. So Anya, sorry, waffly answer. Short answer is, I think you're right. We can answer the question, we can just cut out emotion. I think that some people will want to argue that it's because of the relation between moral conviction and emotion that moral convictions drive political action. But not everybody will accept that, and I think that's controversial. So there's a good question, why is it that moral attitudes, as opposed to attitudes more generally, influence political behaviours? And the answer might be to do with emotion, it might not be. And it's also related to a problem or an issue about moral foundations theory itself. So lots of fun. Anya, how am I doing? Good, all right. Thank you very much, it's a very sharp question. So, Javier, when writing the essay, I was confused on the approach I should take. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Although, of course, confusion is the natural state for us on philosophy courses. On the one hand, I was inclined to focus my discussion on the validity of the evidence to evaluate whether it can be generalised to the general population. But then I realised that looks too much like psychology and not philosophy. Yeah, okay, so thank you, Javier. You know what? On this course, I'm going to take a very open attitude here. And the very open attitude is that there are people coming from different approaches. So we've got psychology people, I think we've got GDP people and so on, as well as philosophy people. And the course isn't really supposed to be saying you have to take a philosophy approach here. So I want to be quite open-minded. And in my own research, I do a mixture of things. So I don't try to publish things just in philosophy. And I don't encourage you to do things which are just philosophy. Indeed, if you're a philosopher, it might be particularly good to try and stretch your legs and take a slightly different approach. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to get out of this module, draw people into philosophy who are curious about philosophy, but also push philosophers a bit to see that they can do other things. So Javier, I think that you're right to be confused. Your confusion is entirely justified. I'm trying to confuse you. Indeed I am. And I also think you should be open to taking a variety of different approaches. The problem is just this. So that makes it all sound very happy and everyone's good. Here's the problem. Last year, so the course is examined by a team of people, and the team of examiners objected that the essays were relatively descriptive. So students actually scored very well. They got relatively high marks on this course. But usually when I'm teaching, I expect the students on my course to be getting really embarrassingly high marks, right? So that there's a statistical problem when it comes to analyse exam results, and people are like, oh, the moral psychology people seem to be doing unbelievably good. Were the questions too easy, Steve? No, they weren't. They're just really good students. So last year you did well, but not brilliantly. And the problem there was that people said a lot of the essays were relatively descriptive. So they were extremely well done, very well researched, very high quality, but relatively descriptive. Now, what I'm trying to do for that reason is, so first of all, to give you fairly descriptive topics so that people who are not familiar with reading and writing about psychology can ease themselves into that without worrying too much about bringing it back to philosophy. But also expanding the third part of the course, which is about consequences of moral psychology for philosophical issues in ethics, in normative ethics, as people sometimes say. What ought we to do? In the hope that that will give lots of people an outlet to be less descriptive. But I'm with you, Trevor. When we're thinking about the first issue, a lot of that really is just about evaluating evidence. And the second issue, again, you have to be able to evaluate a good body of evidence in order to take a view at all. So there are some philosophical issues here, but there's a lot of work you have to do to get to them. Sorry, so what I'm saying is take a variety of approaches. Don't feel like you have to do a narrowly philosophical essay, but be aware, try to avoid being just too descriptive, because that can cause problems depending on who examines the course at the end. Perfect, thanks so much. Okay, good, yeah. Marvellous. Anya, you didn't just miss the emotion point in the lecture, no. And now that you've said this, I will probably change that question for next year, for just that reason, because I see now that it can be confusing looking ahead. All right, good. Do you know what? We haven't got questions at the moment. We haven't got questions. Oh, no, we have. Oh, brilliant. Emily. Very good. So, Emily, 1224, what's the difference between moral attitude and moral convictions? Is it the way that moral attitude could evoke some emotions? Excellent. That's very good. That's very good. Okay, now, so this is one where I'm going to say something, but it might well be that there are other people here who know more than me. So feel free to come in and correct, contradict, object. What I think is that the term attitude is used in psychology as a relatively technical term, but one that we can readily understand. So when we were looking at the research on racist attitudes, we could see that people who were explicitly expressing prejudice in a questionnaire, we could link that attitude to their behaviour. So I've followed the psychological research in using the term attitude, which is the kind of thing that's operationalised by asking people just to express, how you feel about various factors. I'm using that as attitude. And I'm tending not to use the more philosophical term conviction, even though I think that an attitude and a conviction are probably, for our purposes, the same thing. They're probably the same thing. Now, why is that? So when you're writing essays, a lot of people will notice, especially if you're in my seminar group, that I'm going to push you a bit on precision. So if you're talking about one thing, you shouldn't be using two different words. At the same time, here's the other side of that. We're also interested in things that we can make discoveries about. And in order to make a discovery about something, we have to operationalise it. But we don't have, I think, a good way to operationalise attitudes on the one hand versus convictions on the other. In a sense, we're still at the beginning of learning about moral psychology. Despite the last 4 decades or so, there's so much that we don't know. So we ought to collapse things, keeps things simple in order to try and make the first discoveries the simplest discoveries. So I'm going to take a conviction to be just another word for attitude for the purposes of this course, and think that we can't separate those two things experimentally, so we might as well just collapse them. That's where I am, Emily. But let's see, has anybody got an objection or a further insight here? Maybe someone's done some more social psychology on convictions and attitudes. I think we're okay on that for now, but if anybody wants to add anything, of course, I can update later. But for now, attitudes and convictions, for our purposes, we're not going to distinguish. So Steve, what's happening next week in the course? What's happening next week in moral psychology? Steve, that's a really good question, actually. I'm so glad you asked. So at the moment, we're in part 2 of the course, which is really about whether moral psychology has consequences for understanding political conflicts. And the simple idea, we're focusing, of course, on climate change, but actually you get a whole variety of issues that we could focus on. And one in particular is conflict over homophobia. Right, homophobia. So some people think homophobia is okay and other people don't. And that's obviously quite a big sort of political issue in many countries, unfortunately. We're focusing on moral psychology's implications for understanding political conflict. And there's a simple story, and the simple story has proven very attractive. And what you're going to see is lots of researchers still going with this story because it seems quite powerful. And the story essentially is that there's a massive cultural difference between people who are socially liberal and people who are socially conservative. And people who are socially liberal tend to emphasize the individualizing foundation. So they tend to focus on things like harm and unfairness, whereas people on the more sort of socially conservative do think of those as important, but think of them as equally important to things like concerns like purity, loyalty to your in-group or in-groups, and respect for authority. So what are called the binding foundation. So aspects of moral psychology which are thought to be important for holding people together in groups, creating group identities and supporting group identities. So what's interesting is that difference in foundations is supposed to explain many of the political conflicts. So what we're going to see in the case of climate change, for example, is that climate change is typically characterized as a matter of harming the environment or being unfair to future generations. And that seems to be linked to the idea that climate change as an issue is something that draws in people who are politically liberal, with some exceptions, and doesn't draw in people who are socially conservative. Indeed, people who are socially conservative are vastly more likely to be climate skeptics, which is strange because there's no obvious reason why your liberal conservative orientation should make you more or less interested in science. That's a sort of puzzling finding. So here's the general picture that we're going for. Liberals versus conservatives. There is a difference in the way that the innate moral foundations are expressed through different cultures, and that difference has led to conflicts on various political issues. But there's a way to resolve those conflicts without going outside democracy, without having to exert force or cajole people, and that is quite simply to reframe some of the debates around climate change in ways that appeal to both sides. So it turns out it's possible to reframe debates about climate change in terms of keeping the environment pure and showing respect for your group, caring about your own group and doing the right thing for your community. And when you do that, what happens is that liberals will recycle less and people who are socially conservative will recycle more. So that's not very helpful. What that's really doing in a way is just showing that you can make people more or less sensitive to climate change as a political issue by moving from one type of moral foundation to another, but in the process, of course, you're pushing down some people and pushing up other people. However, there is more recent research that suggests that there are ways of framing this which are attractive to all sides, and the claim is that's because it appeals to all of the moral foundations. It's sort of recognised as common ground. The problem here is, and this is where it gets really interesting. Sorry, I should stop because we're over time. But the problem is this, that actually works in practice. So there's quite a bit of experimental research showing that manipulating the kind of moral foundations that are used to formulate political issues changes people's attitudes to the political issues. You can make people who are socially conservative care about the climate, and you can make people who are socially liberal not care about the climate by reframing it. Very interesting. The problem for us is that the theory on which that's based, moral foundations theory, seems to be not super well supported by the evidence. So we've got a really interesting puzzle here, and this is why I think it's interesting also for philosophers to be involved, actually. The theory that we're relying on gives us this marvellous prediction. The prediction is confirmed, but when we look at some problems with the theory, we kind of don't expect the prediction to be confirmed. In fact, we've got reason to think that the prediction shouldn't be confirmed. So we'll see a couple of objections along this line later and be left with a really interesting puzzle about why interventions based on moral psychology are so effective. They do seem to be very effective. That's good news. And the interesting puzzle is that the theory that explains why they're effective doesn't quite seem to be working for us. So Steve, that's what's coming next week in moral psychology. It's going to be a fantastic week, one of my favourite weeks. And after that, we'll move to part 3, which is about thinking about whether moral psychology has consequences for what we ought to do, normative ethics. Excellent, sorry. But here I am, I've been waffling on, and rather marvellously, Emily has another question. So I started, sorry, and I should say, we've gone over now, so if you had somewhere else to be at 12:30, you're late, sorry about that. Emily, you cited a Dutch study, Van Leuven et al., I did, where students had to put themselves on a liberal scale. How can we be sure that the Dutch liberal is the same as the liberal the moral psychologists are talking about, possibly American? Although there are similarities, there are also differences between the idea of what liberal is. Perhaps you believe those differences are not important. Emily, that's exactly bang on the money, actually, and there's quite a bit of discussion about this. So you might think liberal and conservative is taken from a North American context, and you might think that even within North America, what it is to be socially liberal or socially conservative might vary among different groups. It might vary among different groups. So, for example, religion might be a factor in whether you regard yourself as socially liberal or socially conservative, what it means to be one of those things. And I was very struck by this myself, actually. So I was traveling in Utah, and I was just buying something in a shop, and for some reason or other, the shopkeeper realised that we were British and they liked then to talk about Europe, and they said, gosh, you know, over there in Europe, you guys have got a socialist system. You've got a socialist system. And, you know, I sort of sprinted out and went to the newspapers and I was like, wow, there's been a revolution in Europe. This is great. But no, there hadn't been, right? It's just that in the North American context, socialist means that you don't pay for healthcare at the point at which you use it. Who knew? Who knew? Anyway, so that was disappointing. And so Emily, you're absolutely right to think that socially liberal and socially conservative probably have different meanings in different contexts and different groups. However, what's striking, so I think that's a good suspicion. What's striking is that most of the evidence on this actually goes the other way. So if we were asking people about socialism, I think we would get very, very different responses. Not all of it, but most of the evidence, I think, shows you that you get this fairly robust connection between socially liberal and these foundations. You can use this, and also that when you measure socially liberal in different ways, you tend to get roughly the same results. So you can measure it, first of all, by just asking people to rank themselves on a scale. 0 is maximally socially liberal, 7 is maximally socially conservative. Where are you? That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to give them a more detailed questionnaire about specific political issues. And the striking thing is that you don't get much difference between the two ways of doing it, even though in one case it's just self-description, and the other case we're, as researchers, specifying what we mean by being socially conservative or socially liberal. The third way to do it, and this is why I started with Van Leuven and colleagues, they used both an explicit measure where people reported how they feel about themselves, but also an implicit measure where people were shown stimuli that they had to report as being good or bad, and they were just looking at how quickly do you respond in saying something is good if it's something typically associated with a socially conservative issue. So there's a kind of implicit effect there. Everybody ought to say that the good things are good and the bad things are bad, but if you've got something that's normally associated with a socially conservative thing and you're socially liberal, you might be slower to say that it's good and faster to say that it's bad, and conversely. Curiously, so the thing here, Emily, is that across all the three measures, you often get the same things. So, for now, I think we're okay with socially liberal, socially conservative, even though it's a crude tool, for the most part. I think that's right. But this is related to the issue about the Moral Foundations questionnaire not working across lots of different cultures, and that could be partly because of the way conservative and liberals measured. The moral psychologists have the same American definition of what liberal entails. Actually, for the most part, they don't have any definition. So for the most part, when you're asking people to self-rate, you're not really bringing your definition to the table at all. So if I just ask my subjects to rate themselves 0 socially liberal, maximally socially liberal, 7's maximally socially conservative, it's actually the subjects who are bringing their own definition to the table. If we look at the questionnaires that people have used, relatively rarely, they will indeed be based on North American ideas of what's socially liberal and socially conservative, as far as I'm aware. So I don't think, for example, that there's a New Zealand questionnaire that picks out issues in New Zealand for socially liberal, socially conservative. But the important thing is that for the most part, the researchers are not bringing any definition at all. They're just asking people, so the subject's bringing their own definition. Anya, there's probably more to say about that, but I'm going to move on. Anya, administrative note. I like that. Admin note. An admin note. I think administrative note. Anyway, is there a list of week by week? Whoa, hang on a second. Is there a list of week by week lecture topic structures? A list about which topic we're going to be focusing on in specific future weeks? No, Anya, I'm afraid there isn't. What I can tell you is if you look on YY-Rami, you see the essay tasks. So the lectures are always going to be ahead of the essay tasks. That's part of the story. The other part of the story is that next week we're still on part 2, which is trying to get from moral psychology to an understanding of political conflicts and maybe how to make progress there. After that, there might be a little bit of looking back to part 2, but we're essentially, after that, that'll be after reading week, we're all about part 3, which is whether moral psychology, and if so how, has consequences for normative ethics. So that's going to be what's after reading week. But I can't tell you the topic of the particular lectures which are coming after reading week, because actually I'm making it up as I go along. It won't be... Of course, I've got sort of a rough idea, but I want to have the flexibility to make some changes. And a few people spotted that because actually my original plan was to look at dual process theories in part 1 of the course. Just very briefly, I wanted to get going with dual process theories. And as it turned out, there was too much. I got overexcited essentially about some other things. And so the dual process theories are just all going to come into part 3, which in a way I think is better. So Anya, I'm very sorry, there isn't, is the short answer, but you know when part 3 is coming. Part 3 is coming after reading week, and that's the last 4 weeks of the course. Good. Here's Svenja. Hi Steve, I'm a bit confused now about the study on political orientation and the Moral Foundations questionnaire. Are we looking at moral foundations and political orientations as two distinct things that might be correlated? Yes. Or are we trying to find the values that these political orientations represent and that people identify with? No. It's the former, Svenja. It's the former. So what the researchers are mostly trying to do is to look at political orientation as one factor, how strongly you express different moral foundations as another factor. And the simplest way to think about that is the relative weight you put on binding versus individualizing foundations. So that's simple because it gives us a single dimension. Do you lean more binding or do you lean more individualizing? So we've got those two factors, political orientation, moral foundations, and then what most studies are trying to do is to work out how those two factors are related to each other, A, and B, how they each impact decisions on political issues. So in the case of climate change, this is a slight simplification. What most people find is that political orientation as such doesn't explain your attitude to climate change. And that I think makes sense because climate change is a threat for social conservatives as much as socially liberal people. People who are socially liberal sometimes think, well, the conservatives are just nasty, so of course they want the world to be destroyed. But I don't think that's true. I think everyone's nasty. So I think it's very implausible to think that political orientation could explain attitudes to climate change. And for the most part, it doesn't. What you find is that the effects of political orientation on attitudes to climate change are mediated by the moral issues, where you are on the moral foundations. So that's why I think we want to keep these as two separate variables. Now, it's an interesting case, though, where they interact. So a study recently. I haven't got off the top of my head who the authors are, Svenja, but this is very interesting. So it was based in New Zealand. So a group of people in New Zealand, and what they're looking at is the relation between, again, political orientation and moral foundations. And what they had is a group of people who are self-reported socially liberal, self-reported more socially conservative. But within each of those groups, they found quite significant variation on how strongly you lean towards binding versus individualizing foundations. And what these researchers found is that if you're politically liberal and you lean towards individualizing foundations, so you tend to emphasize care, then you are going to be, you're going to report that you're very concerned about, for example, reducing energy consumption. You're very concerned about reducing energy consumption. But interestingly, if you're socially liberal and you are not leaning strongly on the individualizing foundations, it actually goes the other way. The more socially liberal you are, for someone who tends to go a bit more towards the binding foundations, the more socially liberal you are, the less concerned you are to conserve energy. Right? So you get this beautiful interaction between political orientation and roughly speaking, we might think your sort of moral profile. The two things interact. So that's the idea, Svenja. The idea is that we've got two independent constructs, political orientation and your kind of moral profile, and we want to see how the two things produce behaviour. And generally the story is that often the political orientation gets factored out once you take into account the moral profile, but not always. And that's quite a powerful result. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks, Svenja. That's good. Ella, yes, you can ask a question using your microphone. Absolutely. Just dive in.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm really bad at typing. So I was wondering, because you say that there are so many implications of kind of moral foundationalism and moral pluralism on kind of the conflict and the decisions that are made politically, do you think that there are significant or any at all, any implications on the actual structure that we have in place already? For example, democracy. Do you think that there are implications of like the kind of disagreements that people have on that itself?
Ella, thank you. That's a huge question. I do, but I can't back these up. So look, we're well over the half hour, right? This is just an informal chat. So we're talking informally, Ella. And what I would say to you is, without being able to back this up and argue it in detail, here's where I'm going. Here's my own personal motivation. I'm not recommending this to anybody, and I certainly don't think that I could establish it. I think that in order for us to survive democratically, we have to make good decisions. And we face a number of problems, and some of them are fairly easy to solve. So I think that climate change is a fairly easy problem to mitigate. We could do a lot to mitigate climate change, but we don't do that. And likewise, I think global poverty is another one. So there are, just over 1 billion people, unfortunately, who are living in very serious poverty, the kind of poverty that prevents them from getting healthcare and all the rest of it. And it's a fairly easy problem to solve, right? As problems that humans face go, this is one that we know how to solve and we can solve. We have the resources to solve it. So I think there's a clear sense in which democracies are failing. Democracies are failing here quite dramatically. And I think part of that, not all of it, but part of that is because there are these ethical differences, cultural differences that are partly ethical differences. And that when you look at people who are talking to each other, even if you, we'll come to this experiment later, even if you brief people who are socially liberal and you say, look, these are the kind of things that socially conservative people are interested in, and they're put off by these things, and conversely, and you ask people who are socially liberal then to give an argument to a socially conservative person, or conversely, what you find is that most people just use their own moral framework. They don't move outside it. So I think there is a big story here, which is this. If we're going to have a functioning democracy, one that avoids, climate catastrophe, poverty catastrophe and the rest of it, if we're going to have a world that we feel happy living in, then we absolutely need to move beyond our own kind of narrow moral perspectives, and we have to appreciate that there is quite a bit of divergence in people's ethical views, and that's something, you don't have to accept another person's views, but you have to be able to look for ways to express and promote issues that will appeal to the widest possible range of people, where everybody can see what's going on there. So maybe that's an over-optimistic view, but that's where I think all of this is going ultimately. Can I argue for it? No. But I think, in order to make democracy function, we really have to recognise that it's a collection of people who at the moment are not very good at communicating, in part, not entirely, but in part because they're coming at it from different moral foundations, different moral perspectives. And whatever the research ultimately tells us about the theory there, some of the results are really good in demonstrating that change can happen, people can change their attitudes and their behaviours. So I think that what's probably secure is that we need this willingness to be more open ethically. We need this willingness to be more open ethically. And actually climate and poverty are the easy ones. The really difficult ones are going to be things like homophobia, right? Where it's not just a matter of reframing issues in different terms exactly. But we're not going there. We're not going there. Sorry. So yeah, thank you, Ella. I really appreciate being asked that question, and I'm sorry, I just don't have a good answer, is the short thing.
No, thank you. That was really interesting, actually.
Yeah. All right. Nikki, if we use the self-rate questionnaire method, so that's where I say, put yourself as 0 if you're maximally socially liberal, 7 if you're maximally socially conservative, or anywhere in between you like. Would there not be a case for example, countries with very conservative attitudes, even people who regard themselves as liberals, given that we regard ourselves as liberal in relation to others, would still lean towards binding foundations? Yes, that could be. That's a good thought, actually. I wonder if that's true. And we could find out fairly easily. If anybody knows, tell me. What you do, of course, is you just look within 2 countries. So let's think of a really socially conservative country and a socially liberal. So I think New Zealand is pretty socially liberal. And right now, Britain is fairly socially conservative, although it's kind of mixed, isn't it? We shouldn't do Britain, it's too complicated. Socially conservative country. Shame we can't travel back in time. Who's been somewhere that's really... Oh, I know what we should do, actually. We should do it within the North American context. So different states, some states are more socially liberal and some states are more socially conservative. So we could do California versus Utah. And what we could do is just work out, we could standardize. So within each group, you could say, all right, what we're going to do is look at people who are 1 standard deviation from the mean towards the socially liberal end, 1 standard deviation from the mean towards the socially conservative end in Utah. Same thing in California. And Nikki, I think what you're predicting is that if we did that, you'd find that people who count as socially liberal in Utah, regard themselves as socially liberal in Utah, will lean more towards the binding foundations than people who, in a Californian context, regard themselves as comparably socially liberal. Because in order to be socially liberal in California, you've just got to be a lot more liberal, is the idea. I think that's a pretty nice idea. I don't know if it's been done. I think it could be done because the moral foundations theorists, Hyde and colleagues, have collected a lot of data from North America, and they've made that publicly available. So we could probably do it ourselves if it hasn't already been done. Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting. I should ask around. If nobody else knows, I should ask a couple of people who should know and find out if that's already been done. But it's a very nice prediction. Thank you, Nikki. Well, this has been a really nice session. Thank you very much for all of the questions. I really like it if you ask questions in advance, but don't feel any pressure. I understand this week there are assessments and all the rest of it. And as term goes on, it's probably going to get worse, not better. So I think this is fine for a format. If there is something you'd like to do differently in the question sessions, do let me know and I'll consider it. Meanwhile, I'm very much looking forward to seeing you if you're in my seminar group next week. I'll see you on Wednesday. Otherwise, I'll see you on Thursday here again for our live session. Thank you, everybody. Take good care. See you Thursday or Wednesday.